Two police officers were standing at my front door. We had just moved into the house a week earlier. I hadn't done anything wrong. No loud music, no arguments. We'd been home maybe 20 minutes, and my kids were standing behind me in the hallway, staring at these two officers with confused looks on their faces. That was the first time. It happened 6 more times after that. Every single call came from the same man next door. And every single accusation turned out to be completely false. But here's the thing. When someone lies on an official police report, those words don't just disappear. They sit in a file somewhere. And sooner or later, somebody reads them. And eventually, someone did. My wife and I had spent years saving for that house, apartment after apartment, watching every dollar. So when moving day finally came, we weren't excited as much as we were relieved. The kids ran straight into the backyard. My wife and I stood in the driveway and just looked around, and I remember thinking, we actually did it. That feeling lasted about 40 minutes. I was still carrying boxes when I noticed the guy next door. He was standing in his driveway with his arms crossed, just watching me. Not in a friendly way, not even curious, more like he was waiting for me to do something wrong. I walked over anyway, held out my hand and said, "Hey, I'm your new neighbor." He looked at my hand, then he looked at me, and without even shaking it, he said, "Try to keep the noise down." Then he turned around and walked inside. That was it. Never shook my hand, never introduced himself, nothing. My wife had seen the whole thing from the porch. When I came back, she smiled and quietly said, "Well, that's probably going to be a problem." I laughed. I figured maybe he just wasn't good with people. Later, the neighbor on the other side told me his name was Gerald. Late 50s, lived alone, been there about 12 years. And when he said his name, he lowered his voice a little. I noticed that, but I didn't think much of it. I gave Gerald the benefit of the doubt. I kept the music down, made sure the kids stayed away from his side of the yard, waved whenever I saw him. He never waved back, not once, but I kept doing it anyway. For 2 weeks. Then one evening, I opened the front door, and 2 police officers were standing there. One of them asked, "Sir, we've received a noise complaint from next door." And that's when everything started. Tuesday evening. The kids had just gotten home from soccer practice. Dinner was on the stove. Everything felt normal. Then I heard a knock at the front door. 2 police officers, again. One of them said they had received a noise complaint from next door. I actually laughed for a second. Not because it was funny, just because I couldn't believe it. We'd been home maybe 20 minutes. The kids were doing homework. Nothing was even happening. The officers looked around, didn't hear anything, didn't find anything. They apologized for bothering us and left. As the patrol car pulled away, I noticed something. Gerald's curtain moved. He'd been watching. That night, I didn't sleep very well. Not because I was angry. Honestly, I was embarrassed. Police cars in front of your house attract attention, and we were still the new family on the street. I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding, a one-time thing. 11 days later, I was mowing the lawn on a Saturday afternoon when another cruiser pulled up. Noise complaint again. This time, Gerald had added something new. He told them my truck was parked on his property. The officer walked over and measured it himself. 2 feet of clearance, completely on my side. He shook his head, marked the complaint as unfounded, and left. I turned around and noticed one of the neighbors across the street watching from her porch. I just went inside. That night my wife didn't say much, but I could tell she was thinking about it. How many times does this happen? Does it stop? What do we do? Neither of us had answers. 3 weeks later, we invited a few friends over. Nothing crazy. 4 couples. Dinner on the back patio, no music, just people talking and laughing on a Friday night. And then, another police car. Gerald had called again. This one bothered me more, not because of the officers. They were professional, but because one of the neighbors actually came outside to watch. There I was, standing in my own front yard, explaining to an officer that we were just having dinner while people I'd barely met stood around wondering what was happening. The complaint was marked unfounded. Again. The next morning, I walked over to Gerald's house. I kept my voice calm. I knocked on the door. When he answered, I said, "Look, I don't know what the issue is, but I'd really like to figure this out. He stared at me. Then he said, "If you have a problem with how I handle my property rights, take it up with the authorities." And he shut the door in my face. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen. My wife was sitting at the table, not reading, not on her phone, just sitting there, quiet. She looked up and said, "I'm scared to have people over in our own house." I didn't know what to say, because she was right. And that's when I realized this wasn't just an annoying neighbor anymore. Something else was going on, and unfortunately, things were only getting started. By the time the fourth complaint happened, something had changed inside our house. My daughter had stopped sleeping through the night. She was 9 years old. She didn't fully understand what was happening. But kids notice things. They notice stress. They notice when their parents are worried. One morning at breakfast, she looked up at me and asked, "Daddy, are we in trouble?" I smiled and told her no. But honestly, I wasn't completely sure anymore. The fourth complaint involved our dog, Biscuit, a 4-year-old golden retriever. The biggest threat Biscuit had ever posed was to squirrels. According to Gerald, though, Biscuit had become aggressive. He told animal control that our dog was barking violently and charging the fence line. When the officer arrived, Biscuit walked over, wagged his tail, rolled onto his back, and demanded belly rubs. A few minutes later, he fell asleep with his head resting on the officer's shoe. Complaint unfounded. Again. But around that time, I started noticing something strange. Every complaint happened on days when something was going on, when the kids were outside, when friends came over, when we had birthday parties, when family visited. But quiet days, normal days, days when nothing was happening, Gerald never complained, not once. And that's when I realized something. He wasn't bothered by noise. He wasn't bothered by our dog. He wasn't bothered by parking. He was bothered by us, by our family, by the fact that we existed next door. I kept that thought to myself. Then came complaint number 5. And this one finally pushed me into doing something. There had been a storm the night before. One branch from our tree had fallen, but it landed in our yard. I'd cleaned it up that afternoon and taken a couple pictures with my phone, not because I expected anything, just habit. That evening, another officer showed up. Gerald claimed the branch had damaged his fence. According to him, the repairs would cost $2,000. I showed the officer the photos, then I walked him over to the fence. Nothing. No damage, no broken boards, nothing at all. The officer stood there for a second, then looked at me, and before leaving, he paused on the porch, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear, then quietly said, "You might want to start keeping records of all this." That was it. He got in his car and drove away. I walked back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started writing. Dates, times, what Gerald claimed, what the officers found, everything I could remember. One complaint, then another, then another. About 20 minutes into that list, I noticed something Gerald had been giving me this entire time without realizing it. A pattern. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And for the first time since moving into that house, I felt like I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was starting to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every complaint lined up perfectly with something happening at our house. Birthday parties, weekend barbecues, friends coming over, the kids playing outside. Gerald never complained on quiet days. Not once. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't reporting noise. He wasn't reporting problems. He was reporting us. Just us living our lives. I sat there at the kitchen table staring at my notes. Then I looked up something I honestly didn't know you could do. Police reports are public records. You can request copies, and those reports contain the exact words people use when they file complaints. So I requested all of them. When the paperwork came back, I sat down and started reading, and the more I read, the calmer I became. The first report claimed our house had been producing constant disruptive noise for hours. We'd only been home 20 minutes. Another report described Biscuit as aggressive. It said he was barking ferociously and charging the fence line. That dog was scared of squirrels. The fence complaint listed $2,000 in damages to a fence that had absolutely nothing wrong with it. And that's when something clicked. Gerald wasn't just making phone calls. He was putting his accusations in writing, signing his name to them, creating an official record. And every one of those records was sitting in a file somewhere, attached to him. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Honestly, I felt strangely calm, because for the first time, I realized something important. I didn't need Gerald to stop. I just needed him to keep doing what he was already doing. So I got organized. I bought 2 security cameras, one facing the front yard, another covering the side property line. I bought a notebook, and every time something happened, I wrote it down. Dates, times, conversations, police visits, everything. No emotions, just facts. My wife eventually noticed the notebook. She asked, "What are you doing with all this?" I told her, "I'm done waiting for the next complaint. I'm getting ready for it." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. And after that, she stopped asking. 2 weeks passed. Things were quiet, almost too quiet. And honestly, I started wondering if maybe Gerald had finally gotten tired of it. Maybe he'd moved on. Maybe it was over. Then one afternoon he did something that changed everything, because complaint number 6 wasn't about noise, it wasn't about parking, and it wasn't about Biscuit. This time, Gerald accused me of threatening him, and suddenly, this wasn't annoying anymore. This was serious. Complaint number 6 was different. Very different. Up until that point, Gerald had accused us of being noisy, parking incorrectly, having an aggressive dog, damaging his fence, annoying things, frustrating things. But this time, he crossed a line. Gerald told the police that I had threatened him. According to his report, I had walked up to the property line, gotten in his face, and told him he would regret what he was doing. The report used words like aggressive, menacing, threatening. Those aren't neighbor complaints. Those are criminal accusations, the kind that can follow you long after they're proven false. When the officers arrived, I immediately noticed the difference. There were 2 of them, and their tone was more careful, more serious, because they had to treat it seriously. That's their job. My wife was standing behind me in the hallway, arms crossed, the way she always stood when she was trying to stay calm. One officer explained the allegation, then asked for my side of the story. I listened quietly, then I asked, "Can I show you something?" The officers nodded. I walked inside and pulled up footage from the camera covering the side yard, the exact location Gerald described, the exact time listed in the report. We watched the recording together. Nothing. No argument, no confrontation, no threats. No one was there, just an empty yard. The officers watched the footage again. Then I showed them something else, my work badge records. The day Gerald claimed I threatened him, I had clocked into work at 8:14 that morning and clocked out at 6:47 that evening. I wasn't home. I hadn't been home all day. There was no possible way the incident could have happened. One officer looked at the screen, then at his partner. Neither one said anything for a few seconds. Finally, one of them nodded slowly. I could tell exactly what he was thinking, because I was thinking the same thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a neighbor being overly sensitive. This was a lie, a deliberate one. The officers thanked me for my time, then headed toward the door. Before leaving, one of them stopped, turned back toward me, and quietly said, "Hold on to everything you just showed us." Then he paused, and I'd seriously consider talking to a lawyer. That was the second time a police officer had given me that advice. The second time. After they left, the house felt unusually quiet. My wife and I stood in the hallway for a moment. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked at me. "He tried to get you arrested." I nodded. "Yeah." She glanced toward the kids' rooms. "In front of the kids." "Yeah." Another long silence. Then she asked the question we'd both been avoiding. "So what do we do now?" For a moment I didn't answer, because I already knew. This had gone way beyond handling it ourselves, way beyond hoping it would stop, way beyond trying to be patient. That night, I called a friend who had gone through a legal issue the year before. I explained everything: the complaints, the reports, the cameras, the false accusation. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then he said something simple. "Stop talking to me." I laughed. "What?" he said. "Call a lawyer tomorrow." And honestly, that was probably the best advice I'd received during the entire situation. The next morning, that's exactly what I did. And that phone call would end up changing everything. 3 weeks later, Carol from next door sent me a text. "There's an unmarked car outside Gerald's house. It's been there almost 2 hours. Is everything okay?" I looked at the message and smiled. Then I replied, "Everything's fine. Don't worry." Because I already knew what was happening. That wasn't just some random visitor. It was a detective. The prosecutor's office had started reviewing Gerald's complaint history, and somebody had gone to his house with a simple question. Why had he filed 7 complaints against the same family? And why had every single one come up empty? Honestly, I would have loved to hear that conversation. Over the next few weeks, things started moving quickly. Gerald received a letter from the city. His history of complaints had been flagged. Any future reports determined to be malicious could result in fines, not warnings, actual fines. Then came another letter, this one from the prosecutor's office. It was a formal warning. If he filed another false report, he could be facing misdemeanor charges. And suddenly, after 14 months of making everybody else's life stressful, Gerald was the one losing sleep. Then one afternoon, Marcus called me. I was at work. I stepped into the stairwell and sat down on one of the steps. Marcus didn't waste time. "Gerald hired an attorney." I sat there quietly, then asked, "Okay, what does that mean?" "It means they want to settle." For a second, I just exhaled. Not because I was happy. Honestly, it felt more like putting down a heavy box you'd been carrying for a very long time. Their side tried to minimize everything. Said it had all been misunderstandings, miscommunication, neighbors having disagreements. Marcus simply opened the folder. 14 months of reports, footage, dates, badge records, and 7 complaints that had gone nowhere. Facts don't argue. Facts don't need speeches. They just exist. Eventually, they stopped arguing. The settlement covered all of my legal expenses, and there was additional compensation for the stress and disruption caused to our family. I signed a confidentiality agreement, so I can't tell you the number. I'll just say this: it felt fair. But honestly, the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was knowing my family could finally relax. As part of the agreement, Gerald was required to attend a mediation session. Someone actually sat down and explained the proper use of emergency services. Apparently, Gerald spent most of the session in complete silence, which according to Marcus was probably the smartest thing he'd done all year. About a month after everything was over, I heard a knock at the front door, and for a second, I froze. Funny how your mind works after something like that. But when I opened the door, I recognized him immediately. It was the first officer. The one who had quietly told me to start keeping records all those months earlier. He wasn't there officially. He wasn't in uniform. He just smiled. "Heard how everything turned out." I nodded. He nodded back. Then he simply said, "Good." And that was it. He turned around and walked away. I stood there in the doorway for another minute, and it hit me. For the first time in over a year, a knock at the door felt normal again. About 6 weeks after the settlement, I walked outside one morning on my way to work. I made it halfway down the driveway before something caught my eye. A large sign sitting in Gerald's front yard. "For sale." I stopped for a second and just looked at it. Honestly, I expected to feel something bigger. Victory, relief, satisfaction, something. But mostly, I just felt calm, like a chapter was finally ending. For over a year, Gerald had been a constant presence in our lives. Every knock at the door, every police cruiser, every complaint, every stressful conversation after the kids went to bed. And now it was over. The last few weeks before he moved were strangely quiet. Sometimes we'd pass each other outside, walking to the mailbox, taking out trash, getting into our cars, the way neighbors normally do, except neither of us said anything. There wasn't any hostility left, no arguments, no dirty looks, nothing. If we accidentally made eye contact, Gerald usually looked away first, and I'd keep walking. There simply wasn't anything left to discuss. He sold the house about 3 months later. I never found out where he moved, and honestly, I never tried. Once the moving truck pulled away, that was the last time I ever saw him. The neighborhood, of course, eventually figured out what had happened. Neighborhoods always do. Carol from next door brought over cookies one afternoon. The family across the street invited us to their 4th of July barbecue for the first time. And the neighbor who had originally warned me about Gerald months earlier simply patted me on the shoulder one day and said, "Good." Just one word. But somehow it said everything. The biggest change happened inside our house. My daughter started sleeping through the night again. No more questions about whether we were in trouble. No more worrying every time somebody knocked on the door. Things slowly returned to normal. And Biscuit? Well, Biscuit is still terrified of squirrels. Some things never change. Looking back, there's one lesson I learned from all of this. People like Gerald need you to react. They want you angry. They want you frustrated. They want you yelling across the fence or making emotional decisions. Because the moment you do that, the story changes. Suddenly, it isn't about someone filing false reports. Now it's just a neighbor dispute. Two people blaming each other, two sides arguing, and that's exactly what people like Gerald count on. Believe me, there were days when I wanted to walk over there and tell him exactly what I thought. Days when I wanted to confront him. Days when I was absolutely furious. But every single time, I did the same thing. I went back inside, sat down, and wrote everything down. That notebook ended up being more powerful than any argument I could have made. More powerful than anger. More powerful than frustration. Because facts don't forget, facts don't change, and facts don't get emotional. The cameras helped. The lawyer helped. But the thing that really made the difference was starting that record early. One folder, one notebook, one entry at a time. So if you're dealing with something similar, start documenting now. Hopefully you'll never need it. But if the day comes when you do, you'll be very glad you started. And that's my story. Thanks for watching. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor like Gerald, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Take care.